On this edition, I'm going to break down, predict the upcoming fight on the UFC 158 card between Georges St-Pierre and Nick Diaz. Now, it's felt like forever, an eternity for this fight to happen, and it's finally here. I know Dana White saying that he was thinking about pulling Nick Diaz from the card because he wasn't fulfilling his media responsibilities. I mean, this fight's inevitable, whether fans like it or not. Whether he was to pull Diaz off of the UFC 158 card, the fight still needs to happen. There's too much story for you to just leave the chapter or the final chapter of this quote unquote story unwritten. So I'm glad that this fight will be happening. I'm hoping there are no injuries leading up to this fight. What I'm going to do in this video, I'm just going to break down both fighters. I'm going to do my predictions. So I'll start with Georges St-Pierre. Now, Georges St-Pierre is just, I mean, the best way to describe him, he's an athlete. He's just a freak of nature athlete, incredible explosiveness, and he's turned himself into this well-rounded mixed martial artist. The fact that he has such impressive boxing, obviously has the karate background as well, and just his incredible clinch game and his wrestling ability. Georges St-Pierre's wrestling is pristine. Some people consider him one of the best wrestlers in mixed martial arts, and he has just the ability to dictate where the fight takes place at all times. That might just be his biggest advantage going into this fight, is that he can dictate where the fight takes place based on his wrestling. So stylistically, with the wrestling being the biggest hole in Nick Diaz's game, Georges St-Pierre has a huge leg up on it, that he can dictate where the fight takes place. He's also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Georges St-Pierre can lock in submissions on people. He has impressive ground and pound. His ground control is some of the best. And just to elaborate on his stand-up game, I mean, Georges St-Pierre continues to get better every time he shows up in the stand-up game. I mean, just one of the best stiff jabs out there. I mean, Georges St-Pierre's explosiveness and his athleticism makes him such a good stand-up fighter. Obviously, he has very crisp striking, and he has the speed to really get in and get out of danger very quickly. And he mixes in the leg kicks, just very dynamic. So, I mean, really, if we're looking at advantages here for Georges St-Pierre, I think the wrestling is the biggest advantage. He can dictate where the fight takes place. His speed and explosiveness. He's without a doubt the more dynamic striker in this fight as well. Chin, Georges St-Pierre, people always say that he gets wobbled easily. I wouldn't doubt that at all. But George can take a hit. But if Diaz is to start working the body and catching him with a few strikes, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Diaz can finish him. That's if the fight takes place on the feet. So, advantages for GSP, the wrestling, without a doubt. I'd say his speed and his athleticism is also a big factor, in his dynamic striking. There are more levels to his game than just boxing. So I also say some weaknesses for Georges St-Pierre is that I think Diaz is the better Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner. Even though Georges St-Pierre has the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the wrestling combination, I think Nick Diaz is he's just a little bit better on the ground in regards to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I also think Nick Diaz has the better cardio. I know it's hard to say that against an athlete and a specimen like Georges St-Pierre, but Nick Diaz does the triathlons. He can go, I mean, he takes people in the deep water and he drowns them. Where I see Georges St-Pierre being successful, Georges St-Pierre, I mean, it's really tough in this one. I mean, anybody can say is that Georges St-Pierre just needs to wrestle him for 5 rounds, implement his ground and pound, work in some submissions, make Nick Diaz work, and keep him there. But I think there's more to it than that, is that Georges St-Pierre says he wants to show or prove to Nick Diaz he's the better fighter, and he needs to make a statement. I think this needs to be a fight that needs to be done on all levels. But in the stand-up, on the ground, it needs to be done in every facet of the game, or just every aspect of the game. But if I were to say, how's Georges St-Pierre going to be successful? Implement your wrestling, avoid the submission attempts from Nick Diaz off the ground. Obviously, roll with him if he's going to roll with you. But I'd say take him down the ground, implement your ground pound, try and work for the finish or submission. But if this turns into a points match and it turns into a grappling battle, I think Georges St-Pierre can win this one via unanimous decision. I just don't see him finishing Nick Diaz via TKO or knockout. I think Diaz is going to be very active off his back. But I think if George is successful, obviously, it may not be the most fan-friendly way, but if he's successful, he implements his wrestling, dictates where the fight takes place. But if he's trying to impress the fans, if he's trying to really make a statement, he's got to do it in every single area. And I think it could very well be like the Condit fight, where he came out and started to stand with Condit until he got caught. He got rocked, and then he implemented his wrestling. Obviously, when you get put out of your comfort zone or your back's against the wall just a little bit, I think that's ultimately what will happen. Maybe Diaz will catch Georges St-Pierre in the first 3 rounds, and then it'll be wrestling heavy. So, but that's how I see Georges St-Pierre being successful. Nick Diaz. Now, Nick Diaz has been out of the Octagon for a year. I don't question ring rust with him, is the fact that the guy stays active. I mean, may not be in fighting, but I mean, Diaz's training schedule is unbelievable. I mean, it's so unorthodox. He runs triathlons. His cardio is impressive. I mean, few things in regards to Diaz. Diaz's boxing, I mean, it's I don't want to say unorthodox, but I mean, Diaz's boxing is just it's weird to say that it's crisp, but I mean Diaz is he's such a smart boxer. He's a volume striker. It's not so much it's going to be flashy. He's going to be so super just so fast and cut you off with strikes. It's just that Diaz knows exactly what to do. He has an impressive 1-2. He throws in volume. He likes to work the body and chop fighters down, and likes to corner him against the cage. And that's where he really opens up on the body and lets the volume go. But the question is, can a guy with great boxing like Diaz corner Georges St-Pierre, who is so much faster and so much more of an athlete? I mean, I question that. Is that Diaz is nowhere near as fast as Georges St-Pierre, and I got ridiculed for this. I'm a huge Diaz fan, and I'm being realistic here. Is that I would love to pick Nick Diaz and say that he's going to win this fight and outbox Georges St-Pierre, and I think it's a possibility. But he does not possess the explosiveness. He lacks the speed advantage in this. But that's not taking any credit away from how amazing Nick Diaz's boxing is. I mean, he really imposes his will. And it's the pace that he pushes on people. Is that he's constantly in your face. You're suck and win by the third round because it's just such an excruciating pace that very few fighters can deal with. But it's a pace that Georges St-Pierre can deal with. It's just a matter of it can stay on the feet. And Diaz isn't a knockout artist. I mean, he really beats you down. I mean, you wilt by the third round. If you've been standing up and trading for 3 rounds with Diaz, he's going to beat the body up. You're going to be seeing double, seeing triple, because I mean, it's like bee stings. They add up over time, but he's not a knockout artist. So Diaz's boxing, I mean, I'd still give the stand-up advantage to Georges St-Pierre, but I mean, Diaz's boxing is beyond serviceable in this fight. It's just the explosiveness and the speed that I really question. In regards to the ground game, I mean, that's the whole, is that Diaz is not a wrestler. I mean, that's one thing Diaz brothers have always struggled with, is wrestlers, and you're facing the best wrestler, I mean, just one of the best wrestlers, if not the best wrestler in mixed martial arts. So, and Georges St-Pierre's speed, I mean, it's tough. Is that, I mean, can Diaz's grappling hold up? Can he keep this fight standing? I think it's going to be very tough. I mean, Georges St-Pierre could dictate where this fight takes place, and he's going to keep Diaz guessing. But here's the thing, is that Diaz is an incredible Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. He can very well submit Georges St-Pierre off his back, but I mean, it would take a lot. Is that Georges St-Pierre is no slouch on the ground. He's also very much an exceptional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt as well. But I'd definitely give Nick Diaz the advantage on the ground in regards to the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu aspect. But in regards to the wrestling, I mean, without a doubt, Georges St-Pierre. So a couple things, pros and cons really for Nick Diaz in this fight. I think his cardio is a huge factor. Is that if Georges St-Pierre is going to stay busy and work for the finish, I think Nick Diaz will very much remain fresh in this fight. Is that he can really go into deep water and stay fresh. And another pro I'd have to say is that, I mean, his boxing is hard for people to deal with. I mean, he could very much cut off Georges St-Pierre, maybe not with the speed, but I mean, he is a handful to deal with in the boxing. And Diaz, just his toughness. I mean, he's got an incredible chin. There's no quit mentality. And, also how he kind of eggs fighters on and really wants them to engage with him. I mean, I don't know if it will work against a guy like Georges St-Pierre who's 100% focused, but I mean, Diaz tries to look for the fish. He wants to beat you up, so I'd say that's a pretty big advantage as well. Weaknesses, without a doubt, the wrestling. Also, I mean, he's not as dynamic as a striker as Georges St-Pierre, and he struggles to dictate where fights take place. Where I see Nick Diaz being successful, I mean, I think Nick's got to keep this one standing. I think he's got to really capitalize on the moments on his feet. You got to really come out early and make a statement early, because if you let Georges St-Pierre roll and get into the routine of having the confidence, I mean, Diaz has got to come out early and steal the confidence. And he's got to make the most of the stand-up exchanges, and also, I mean, if he's on his back or whatever it is, he's getting taken down, he's got to roll and he's got to try and get in the down position, which is also a very tall task. But I think it's merely about Diaz capitalizing on the chances that he has, and he's challenging Georges St-Pierre to come to the ground, so maybe he can be successful off his back. I wouldn't put it past him to lock Georges St-Pierre in a submission, but it's a reach. Nick Diaz needs to finish this fight. He will not win this fight if it goes to decision. No, there's no way. The takedowns will ultimately win Georges St-Pierre the decision in this fight. Diaz has to finish, and it needs to be done either on the feet or on the ground. So where my prediction lies in this fight, and this is a tough one. I'm a diehard Diaz fan, and I'm also a fan of Georges St-Pierre, but I'm a huge Diaz fan, and I've continued to play this fight out in my mind so many times. I mean, it's been years. I mean, really everything. What would happen? Georges St-Pierre and Nick Diaz fight each other. I'll still very much be rooting for Nick Diaz, but in regard to predicting this fight, I have to play this one safe, and I'm gonna have to say that I think Nick Diaz will get his strikes in. I think we'll see a bloodied up Georges St-Pierre, but I think also we'll see a bloodied up Nick Diaz. I think this one's going to go the distance, and I think when it comes down to it, I think Georges St-Pierre won't finish Nick Diaz, but I think this is going to be an exciting fight. I'm certainly hoping it will be, but I think Georges St-Pierre is going to implement his wrestling. He's going to win this fight via unanimous decision and still be the welterweight champion in the UFC. So I'm hoping for an exceptional fight. I just really hope these guys will square up and go to battle and just have a war, because there's a lot to prove. There's a lot on the line. There's a lot that's been said. That's my prediction. I'll take Georges St-Pierre defeating Nick Diaz via unanimous decision on the UFC 158 card. And that's what I have for this edition. It's Kyle Delaney signing off. I'm out of here.